Good afternoon. Welcome to the CERIAS Security Seminar from Purdue University. Our speaker today is a PhD student from Indiana University, Vaibhav Garg. He is also a graduate of this course, has taken it twice when he was here at Purdue for his master's degree. His research is in the area at the intersection of information security and behavioral economics. So this should be an interesting talk. His title today is Risk Perception of Information Security Risks. Vaibhav?
Hello, I hope you're all awake. I know it's like the end of the day. I know when I took the course, I wasn't particularly excited about having it at the end of the day. So the title of my talk is Risk Perception of Information Security Risks, and I'm from Indiana University. So the big research question that I'm looking at is when we design risk communication for non-experts, what we want to identify is what is the relevant information for the specific user in a particular context. Right? So for example, the information that I want to provide to you in a social networking context is not the same as information that I want to provide to you when you're going onto an unencrypted website and I want to tell you that it's not SSL encrypted, right? So why do you have a security conundrum? Well, in the good old days, computer systems or information systems in general were used by experts, right? So over here you see like Gene Bardik working on the ENIAC. The problem happened that the systems that were used by experts and were designed for experts soon stopped being used by experts and started being used by regular folk, right? And so as computer scientists, we decided that the problem lies between keyboard and chair, right? And so we tried to do things to inform non-experts on how to use these systems correctly, right? So so we tried security education. So the anti-phishing fill from CMU is like a security education effort to teach non-experts about phishing. Then we tried to design pop-up boxes telling people that don't go to an unencrypted website. And the new initiative is like public awareness campaigns. So stop, think, connect kind of stuff, right? Now, there are obviously limitations to most of these efforts, right? So we spend years and years and years trying to convey to end users that, look for that lock sign, right? That lock sign is critical. If you have that lock sign, it means that website is SSL encrypted. Now, of course, there's a bunch of people who, for one reason or the other, have decided to misuse that lock sign. So do you guys know what is the picture on the right? I don't know if you can see it very clearly. Do you guys recognize where this login is from? Maybe it says on there. PayPal, right? So PayPal is like what they're doing is just, it's marginally criminal because they have taken years and years of effort on the signal that we have developed that the log sign represents SSL encryption, and then they took the log sign and took it out of context, just placed it in the middle of the page, and it really means nothing, right? So PayPal is one of the easiest websites to phish because when users go, looking for the PayPal website, they just look for the log sign in the middle of the page, and then, if it's a phishing website, they never really realize that, no one's really looking at the address bar, no one's really looking at where the certificate is coming from. On the other hand, it's also sometimes misused by security experts for social commentary. So I've blacked out the website, but my advisor uses it. That you can place a log sign anywhere, but it doesn't really mean anything. So part of the problem is because we've treated non-experts like we treat experts, right? So we think about non-experts as rational end users, right? If I provide you this piece of information, you're going to think about that information, think about what risks, cost-benefit analysis goes into it, and I'm going to take a very, very rigorous algorithmic decision, right? So I tell you that you're going to go on the website, it's not SSL encrypted. You can either not go to the website, or you can add an exception, right? Does anybody see a problem with this? What would happen if computer scientists decided to design a warning label for smoking? This is kind of how the warning label would look like. Smoking is a factor which contributes to lung cancer, yada, yada, yada. I've provided you with a lot of technical information, but it doesn't, as in, non-expert, it doesn't really do anything for me, right? So for a long, the second discourse that came along is the problem of usability. This information is too complex. What we need to provide is we need to provide some usable information. So we designed something else, right? Now, how many people in this room smoke? Actually, don't raise your hands. You're not being recorded, so you can't raise your hands, I guess. But as someone who smoked for 8 years, the sign which says smoking kills never really deterred me from having another cigarette, or really packs and packs of cigarettes, right? So it's because, like, to a degree, we don't understand how people perceive risk, right? So what is risk? Risk is, when you invest into Wall Street, that's a risk, right? When you're driving your car, that's a risk. Every time you share information through your phone, that's a risk, right? So risk comes from the Italian word riscare. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, which is to dare, right? And as computer scientists, when we think about how people evaluate risks, we often confuse that with how experts evaluate risk, right? Experts evaluate risk by looking at what is the probability of something happening, and you multiply it with the magnitude of the consequences of that thing happening. And the idea is, I do this multiplication, I get the expected value for a particular set of activities, and if that expected value is greater than what my expected utility from that activity would be, I simply don't do that, right? If I get a lot of utility out of smoking a cigarette, right? So the expected utility is very high, but the expected value of the risk is relatively low, I'm going to go and smoke a cigarette, right? And vice versa, if the expected utility is lower than the expected value, I'm not going to smoke a cigarette. Now, do you guys do any adventure sports? Anyone? Do you guys drive? Yeah? So how many times before you decide to drive do you think about statistics about driving accidents, right? And you contemplate, if I go down this road, this is the probability of an accident happening, and this is the magnitude of me getting into an accident. You don't actually engage in that rational risk calculus, right? And even if you do, that expected value doesn't mean the same thing in every context. I'll give you an example. So let's say you can win $10 for sure, right? I'm going to just walk up to you and give you $10, right? That sounds like a good idea, but I have another prospect for you. I can give you $100 with a probability of 0.1. So who wants the $10 and who wants the maybe $100? $10. The maybe $100? All right. So from the people who participated, there were about 8 people who wanted $10, and there were about 2 people who wanted the maybe $100, right? And overwhelmingly, most people want that certain gain, right? And it goes back into if you look in folk sayings, bird in hand, it blows tube in the bush, and yada yada yada. And this is called the certainty effect, right? When you are going to win something, you are going to go for the small certain gain versus the probable uncertain gain most of the times. But if I change this question and I ask you, well, I'm going to walk up to you and take $10 from you for sure, or I'm going to walk up to you and maybe take $100 from you, which one are you guys going to go for? So this is going to be slightly leading, so I'm just going to answer this myself. Overwhelmingly, in experimental conditions, people will say, well, I want to lose maybe $100, right? I don't want to lose $10 for sure. So it's the same gamble, right? It's the same gamble. It's the maybe $10 versus, the certain $10 versus the maybe $100. But if you're winning it, you want the certain $10, but if you're losing it, then you want the maybe $100, right? And so this is called reflection effect. Just the way, the context in which the gamble is presented changes your preference, right? So we're doing the same thing. As the expected value in each case is the same, right? Because $100 into the probability 0.1, the expected value is still $10, right? And the expected value was $10 in the first case as well. So we have to realize that we are not designing for some kind of rational, super homo economist kind of being, right? We are designing for Homer Simpson, right? And Homer Simpson does not, think about, all the probabilities and all the expected values. He doesn't have time, and there's a evolutionary imperative for not making algorithmic decisions, right? So say a long time ago, a tiger was about to attack you, right? And you had an algorithmic brain. So you're going to say, well, the tiger is traveling at the speed of, I don't know what, let's say 90 kilometers an hour for the heck of it, right? And it's about 20 meters away, so it will reach me in X amount of time. By the time you make that computation, the tiger would have eaten you, right? It's much more simpler just to go, that's a tiger, it's pretty close, let's run, right? You don't need to make an algorithmic research. Similarly, if I want to pick this water bottle, I'm not going to calculate exactly how far away it is, and so we don't use algorithms, we use heuristics, right? Heuristics are quick, they're dirty, and because they are quick and dirty, they're suspect to systematic biases, right? So we are not rational, we are only boundedly rational. So how have we tried to address bounded rationality, for security and privacy risks? So there have been two schools of thought that have been, that have really looked into it. So one is looking at mental models, right? So mental models are, internal representations of external reality, and there are two key scholars that come to my mind. One is Jean Camp at Indiana University. Disclaimer: she's my advisor, so of course I'm going to bring her up. But it's also very pertinent, right? And then there's Rick Wash at Michigan State. Right? So Rick Wash looks at mental models of non-experts, and Jean looks at mental models of experts. And so Jean says that typically security experts use 5 mental models. One is like the medical mental model. So when we talk about viruses, that's a medical mental model. Or we use a criminal mental model. So when we say identity theft, that's a criminal mental model. Physical. So when we say firewall, that's a physical mental model. Warfare, when we talk about defense in depth, that's a warfare mental model. And economic, right? So when we talk about adware and that kind of stuff. So we use 5 key mental models. And of these, physical mental models are the ones that are most accessible to non-experts, right? So, I mean, an easy way of thinking about mental models is, when I talk to my dad about a computer, to him, a computer is like a television. You buy it once, you put it in your house, and it's done, right? You never have to do anything with it. And then I have to explain, it's not like a television, it's more like a car. You buy it once, and then you fix it for the rest of your life, right? And so that's the mental model that is more aligned. If I give the example of a car, he understands what I'm talking about, right? So just like you have to take your car for regular maintenance, you have to patch your computer regularly, right? You have to patch your software, you have to update it, all that stuff. Now, the second thing that has been trying to look at bounded rationality is this nudging approach, which has been propounded by Alessandro Cristi from Carnegie Mellon, and he basically says that there's a way you can structure the system in 2 different ways, right? Just by having the architecture designed in a different way, I can either make it more risk-taking or I can make it more risk-averse. So, for example, do you guys, how many of you joined Facebook when Facebook had just started off? Right? So if you guys remember, at that point of time, Facebook privacy controls by default used to be reasonably stringent, right? And over a period of time, Facebook made the default settings more and more open, right? And the reason they did it, because almost no one ever changes defaults, right? It doesn't matter what your preference is. You never mess with defaults unless there's a very small percentage of people who mess with defaults. So if it's open by default, you're automatically more risk-taking, right? And if it's closed by default, you're automatically more risk-averse, right? If you guys have any questions, feel free to stop me and ask me at any point in time. All right. So that is great, right? But it still comes back to the question of we still don't know how people evaluate risks, right? How people perceive risk. I can make risk information more accessible to non-experts by using the right mental models, and I can nudge them to be more risk averse by structuring the architecture in a certain way, but I still need to understand how they perceive risk when they go online, right? Um, and this matters not just online, but there's a wide body of literature that has examined how people perceive risk offline as well. So, for example, why is it that I'm very happy? Did anyone see? There's an Onion piece about. Do you guys know the Onion? Onion is the satire magazine, and they did this piece about CIA's secret program, which is NSA's secret program, which is called Facebook. And NSA has basically come up with a very, very cheap way of keeping track of everyone, and that's called Facebook. They don't have to invest anything in it. People voluntarily give out information. Right? So why is it that people are not really that worried about information sharing on Facebook, but at the same time they get so pissed off when they learn about like how Big Brother is watching them, right? It's the same information, but in the case of Facebook, they're giving it out voluntarily, so it doesn't bother them that much. But in the other case, that information is being taken from them involuntarily. They don't know about it. They don't have control over it, and that's what bugs them, right? So voluntariness is a key component of how if it's a voluntary activity, you typically perceive it to be less risky. If it's involuntary, you typically perceive it to be more risky. Similarly, how immediate is going to be the impact of that activity? So, anyone who has, again, I'm going to ask who smokes here, but it doesn't matter. You don't really fear when you have one cigarette at a time, right? I mean, maybe people here don't smoke, but people who do smoke would happily go and have one cigarette, right? On the other hand, even hardcore smokers are not going to try what the gentleman on the left is trying to do, which is he's trying to smoke about 100 packs of cigarette in one go, right? And it's because when you have one cigarette, it doesn't kill you right now, right? It's not going to kill me right now. When I'm 50, I'm going to be coughing and not being able to breathe and have emphysema. That's when I'm going to really figure out that smoking is bad for me, right? But I'm not going to try and smoke 100 packs of cigarettes because that is going to kill me right now, right? That makes sense. Knowledge to the exposed. How much do you know about something? If the more you know about so a lot of people are scared of genetically modified foods, right? And part of the reason is like they don't have enough knowledge about it, right? And the knowledge that they have sometimes increases their risk, their perception of risk, and in other cases decreases their perception of risk, right? So depending upon the situation, the more knowledge you have may make you more risk-taking or make you risk-averse. Similarly, how do people feel about what knowledge do experts have about the risk? So, for the same amount of calories, a lot of people would rather have cane sugar than they would have high fructose corn syrup. Even though it's the same amount of calories, they feel like science is on the side of cane sugar, and they would go for cane sugar, right? Control. Why do we feel safer while driving? How many people feel safer while driving than flying? No one? All right. How many people feel safer while flying than driving? You feel safer while flying. All right. Well, so part of it is control. In general, when you ask that question, most people feel safer while driving than they feel flying. And part of it is control. When you're driving, you feel like you're in control. You feel like if you get into a crash, you could jump out of the car, do some kind of Keanu Reeves move. But if you get into a crash in the air, there's really not that many places to jump, right? Actually, jumping is not. So Can people figure out the difference between these two pictures? Can someone point to me which is a nuclear reactor and which is a coal power plant? Which is a nuclear power plant and which is a coal power plant?
I think the nuclear's on the right.
Yep, you got it. So this pretty much looks the same. Ironically, coal power plants produce more radiation than nuclear power plants. But if you want to build a nuclear power plant in someone's backyard versus a coal power plant, most people will go for the coal power plant, citing that nuclear power plants cause radiation, when scientifically it's the other way around. And part of the reason is because coal power plants are something that we've had around for a while, right? It's not a new risk, right? Nuclear power plants are relatively new. Common dread. How many people remember where they were when 9/11 happened? How many people remember where they were the last time the E. coli bacteria epidemic happened? About 10 times more people died in the E. coli epidemic than they died in 9/11, right? Because food poisoning happens on a regular basis. You don't really think about it, right? It's a common risk, right? As opposed to dying in a terrorist attack, which is something rare, right? It happens, well, hopefully never. But if it does happen, it's a very rare event, and it leaves a significant impression in your mind, right? It's how glamorous the event is. How many people die in one incidence of that risk being realized? So more people die in car crashes every year than the number of people. So actually, more people died in car crashes in 2001 than the number of people who died in the 9/11 attack. But again, you're not going to see the same amount of investment in the automobile industry safety as you're going to see in the military industrial complex, just because we don't perceive those risks similarly, right? And it's very important to recognize that, because not only do we individually make different decisions on how we perceive risk, as a society, right? As a society, we invest in different things based on how we perceive the risk and how insecure we feel about that risk, right? So if you think about it, the United States government spends, I think, 3 times the money on breast cancer research than they spend on heart disease, right? Even though more people die of heart disease than they die of breast cancer. But on the other hand, and in fact, we are no closer to having, in fact, we have poorer diagnostic tools for diagnosing heart disease and related ailments, especially in women. But you don't really hear that much about it. Why? Because Angelina Jolie does not come out on stage and talk about heart disease. She comes out on stage and she talks about breast cancer, right? It's something that is much more easily available in your memory, right? It's a tangible event. Severity. How many people die of shock attacks every year? Any? How many people are scared of shocks? I'm deadly scared of shocks, right? So, is it going to give you a nosebleed, or is it going to tear you from limb to limb? Kind of has a significant impact, right? So it's very important to study perceived risk. It's very important to identify what are the dimensions, what are the underlying determinants of how we evaluate risks as boundedly rational human beings. So traditionally, when we wanted to study, what is the acceptable level of risk, how much risk are people willing to accept for a typical activity, the traditional methodology was the key proponent of that was Starr, and he used this methodology called revealed preferences. And he argued that over a period of time, as a society, we have come to an optimal level of trade-off between risk versus benefit, right? So all you have to do if you want to look at what is acceptable risk is look at past databases of behaviors, and you can identify what is acceptable risk and how risk is perceived, right? Do you guys think there might be any problems with that methodology? Go for it.
Those databases are old behaviors, and the new things we've got are new behaviors.
That is partly the problem. Actually, star said exactly the same thing, and it's going to be on the next slide. There's other problems too, right? We assume, what is the assumption behind this model? We assume that people are rational human beings, right? We assume that people know what risk they are taking, right? But in general, you don't. You don't really know how much risk you're taking. How many people who bought the Ford Pinto knew that the gas tank was going to explode? Right? So this approach is particularly difficult to apply to security and privacy, because security and privacy risks online are really new, right? Most of the times we don't have databases of past behaviors. And even when we have databases of past behaviors, the nature of the risk has significantly changed, right? So if you're talking about accepting spam email, right? Spam used to come from, a very different set of sources before, and now it comes from a very different set of sources, right? Originally, when you did not have blacklisting, I could send spam to many, many people, and I could do it every day repeatedly, right? Now what do people who send out spam, now what they do? Because they get blacklisted, what do they use? They use spam bots, right? They use other people's systems, right? So the nature of the risk has changed, even though it's the same risk, right? So the other thing that we can do is we can use express preferences. And express preferences is, well, I walk up to you and ask you, well, how do you feel about this risk, right? How do you perceive this risk? So express preferences surveys people to ask them about their risk preferences. Do you think there might be a problem with this methodology? What do you think might be a problem? Different people have different degrees of risk. The other problem is if someone comes up to me and asks me certain questions. So there's something called a Wilder effect in polling. So I'm going to say that I like privacy just because everyone, I care about privacy just because everyone tells me that I should care about privacy, right? So it's difficult to ascertain that what you're expressing as your attitude is your actual attitude, right? So what I'm trying to say is that there are two ways of studying perceived risk, and both ways have their limitations. But express preferences is the approach that we have used in a study, mostly because it has the advantage of being grounded in bounded rationality versus revealed preferences, which is grounded in rational economics, right? But at the same time, you have to recognize that it has its own limitations, right? So we did a preliminary study because we wanted to see what is the perceived risk of, so there's like 15 risks on your, on the projector, and we want to see, how did people feel about this risk? Do they feel that these risks are voluntarily taken, right? Is the impact of these risks immediate, or is it later on, right? How much do they know about the risk? How much do they feel experts know about the risk? Can they control the consequences of these risks? Are these risks new? Are they old? So the same 9 dimensions that I talked about previously, right? So we had a convenience sample. Go for it. We had 93 participants, 71 women, 22 men. And what did we find? We found that of all those 9 dimensions, the only thing that the thing that people cared about most is severity of the consequences. What happens if a virus infects my computer, right? Does it simply slow down my computer, or does it lead to just data loss, so that I can't recover any of the information that I have stored on my machine, right? And of the 15 risks that we studied, we found that identity theft was the one that people were most scared of, right? So even though phishing can lead to identity theft, phishing was not considered to be as scary, right? Can you guys make a guess about why phishing might not be as scary as identity theft?
Is it because it's easier to detect?
Phishing is easier to detect than identity theft. All right. You can control. All right. Any other answers? Think of why this might be not for you, but for your parents or for your grandparents, why this difference might happen. Because your parents might know about identity theft, but they really might not know about phishing. I mean, when I go and talk to non-experts, a lot of times when you say things like phishing and zombies and cookies, well, now people kind of know about cookies, but 2 years or 3 years ago, if you say phishing or if you say zombies, when you say phishing, people think of phishing. When you talk about zombies, people think of. I was going to say real life zombies, but that's an oxymoron. But you get the idea, right? So identity theft is something that we understand on a fundamental level, right? It's a risk that has existed independently. Even before the internet, identity theft used to happen, right? It's something that we've dealt with for a long period of time. So availability is a key thing. We've known this risk for a long time, right? It's very salient in our minds. It's also, theft is something that we understand as a mental model, right? We understand that theft is bad. We have a negative connotation for that word already. So there are a bunch of limitations for the study. It was a convenience sample. It was gender biased. It was mostly women. It was with undergraduate students at library science school. So they were relatively more informed than your traditional non-expert would be. So we did a second study, and this time we also wanted to see, since I made that hypothesis that identity theft is more scary because it's a mental model that we understand. So I wanted to see what are the differences when you use different mental models. Are some mental models more accessible than others? The other thing is, one of the criticisms that we got is, well, no one really knows what zombies are. No one really knows what botnets are. No one really knows what malware is. So people don't know about these risks. So all their answers are completely arbitrary. And so your study might as well just be generated, the data in your study might as well be generated by a random number generator, right? So we wanted to see how people react to risks that actually exist in the real world. And then we threw in a bunch of risks that were just made up, right? So we had these risks. So we had 5 risks for every mental model. 5 risks for medical, 5 for criminal, 5 for physical, warfare, economic. And then we had like a catch-all category for risks that did not fit into any of these mental models very clearly. So, sniffing, cookies, phishing, vampires. Now, for those who see vampires on that projector and are wondering what information security risk is vampires, well, it's not an information security risk because, I threw in a bunch of fake risks. So digital pandemic is not an actual risk. 516 hustle is also not an actual risk. Drone payload is not a risk. Not an information security risk. So made a bunch of fake risks, and we also gave them a bunch of real risks. And so when you do human subject studies, you have to get an IRB approval. Everyone knows about this? All right. And then instead of doing this study with a typical undergraduate population, we ran the study on Mechanical Turk, right? So everyone knows what Mechanical Turk is? Excellent. We had 332 participants. Because that survey was slightly complex, we wanted the participants to be native English speakers. Then because we wanted the people on Amazon Mechanical to actually pay attention to our survey instead of just blindly clicking options, we chose people who had an approval rating of more than 95%. And at the same time, we also kept on asking them some validation questions to make sure that they are paying attention. So what did we find? We found that, again, severity was the most important dimension, right? People mostly cared about, how severe are the consequences of taking that risk. Identity theft was, again, the most risky activity of all those activities that we listed. This was kind of interesting. So, we wanted to compare how people respond to fake risks versus how people respond to real risks, So we found out that for fake risks, the 9-dimensional model of voluntariness, control, knowledge, for fake risks, that model could explain 30% of the variance in perceived risk. For real risk, that model only explained 15% of the variance in perceived risk. So when it's a fake risk, when you have no idea what the risk is all about, what happens? You make a more effective judgment, right? You just make stuff up. So because you have no idea how to actually really evaluate that risk, right? But when you have a real risk, you have a better idea of what that risk is all about, so there's less variance. Anyways, the other thing that we looked at is we also compared, we had a small portion of participants who self-identified themselves as experts, and by experts here we mean people who had a computer science degree or people who had some information security training or degree in information security. And we found out that that for severity was very important for non-experts, but it really wasn't very important for experts. For expert, the only thing that mattered was the knowledge to the experts. Right? So this is a critical difference, right? And at the same time, for non-experts, their general privacy preferences were a good indicator of how risk-averse or risk-taking they were, right? On the other hand, for experts, it was not their privacy preferences, but their frequency of use of technology, like how often do they interact with ICT systems. That was the component that determined whether they found something to be risky or non-risky. Now, if you think about how that would translate into risk communication, as experts, we are going to talk about security risks as security risks. But for non-experts, what they understand better is if we can somehow frame those security risks as privacy risks, right? So if we can talk about how having malware on your computer is not only a security risk, but it's also a risk to your privacy, right? If you have malware on a computer, it might be a keylogger, and it would record all your passwords and send it to some, drop zone in Romania or something, right? So again, there was a bunch of limitations. We have a small sample of experts. The experts were self-defined. And again, we are only talking about technical risks, right? And we have no idea how perceived risk balances out with perceived benefits, right? Because usually when you're taking when you're doing something risky, you're not just doing it because, for funsies, you're also doing it because you're getting something out of it, right? So we decided that we want to use a context that is very, very familiar, where people, it's not a technical risk. People understand what is the risk of sharing this, to a degree, people understand what this information means. So we used the context of social networking, and we did the same thing. We asked people to rate the risks on the 9 dimensions of risk. And the risks that we considered were information items that you typically share on Facebook. So things like name, date of birth, telephone number, address, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, political affiliation. Now, for some people, things like religious affiliation or sexual orientation, work experience, or, well, obviously telephone number are very private things, right? They don't necessarily want to share it with everyone. So in this case, people understand, or arguably, people have some kind of mental calculus that they're performing to identify whether the benefit of sharing that information on a social networking website is more or less than the risk of sharing that same information, right? On the one hand, if I share my telephone number on Facebook, all my friends have it, and they can call me, whenever they need me to. On the other hand, if I share my telephone number on Facebook, all my friends have it, and they can call me whenever they want. So the first thing that we looked at is like perceived risk versus perceived benefit. Is there a relationship? Is it that the higher the risk of doing something, the higher the benefit? Or is it the opposite? The more benefit that you see in an activity, the less risk you see in it. So typically, when when these studies are done for offline risks, so things like smoking, driving, or flying, or genetically modified foods, and etc., you see that the higher the perceived benefit, the lower is the perceived risk. And the only exception to that I know of is nuclear energy in an American context. Nuclear energy is considered to be very highly beneficial and also extremely risky. Right? But in the case of social networking, we did not see this relationship. Right? There was no relationship at all. It's not that perceived risk was directly proportional to perceived benefit, and it's not that perceived risk was inversely proportional. There was just no and again, the key component of perceived risk was severity, like what is going to be the impact of sharing that information on Facebook, right? Another key thing was how much do you know about the consequences of sharing that information on Facebook. So typically, when you think about the privacy paradox, do you guys all know the privacy paradox? So the privacy paradox basically talks about, on the one hand, if you ask people, how do you feel about privacy? They say we are very, very concerned about privacy. On the other hand, they go to Facebook and share every bit of information about their life. So that is called the privacy paradox, that you say something, but you behave in a different way. Right? And there are typically three reasons that are given for the privacy paradox. Reason number one is people simply don't care. Right? When you ask them in surveys, they lie to you because they don't want you to feel bad, right? You're doing this study, you put in all this effort. The second reason that is given is people do care, but people don't know enough about the risk, right? I care about my privacy, but I simply did not realize what would happen if I shared, the photograph of me drinking, past midnight, not realizing that my advisor is also friends with me on Facebook and will know when I don't show up for class the next day, right? It has never happened. So we found that the more people knew about the risk of the sharing this information, the more risk they perceived there was. So we do find some support for the second hypothesis that people do care about privacy. They simply don't know enough. Right? Another thing that we found is when it's voluntary information sharing, people are happy to share information. And when they feel that they can control the publication of that information, they share more information. This is kind of really ironic, right? If you think about it, if I provide you with stronger privacy controls, instead of sharing less information, you're going to take those privacy controls, feel more empowered, and actually share more information, right? So arguably, so do you guys know the Do Not Track initiative? All right. So Do Not Track is this initiative by the FTC where FTC is asking all web browsers to implement a flag called Do Not Track. And as a user, if you switch that flag on, it's going to signal to all, to the websites that you go that you do not want to be tracked. And so they're not going to collect behavioral information about you, right? And it's on most web browsers, it's opt-in. So you have to actively switch it on. So, if you're using Chrome or Safari or something like that, but Microsoft has decided that they're going to do something different and they're doing it opt-out. So you have to actively opt out, and so you have to actively agree to being tracked. Right? Now, what is the purpose, what is the policy insight that we get out of it? The policy insight that we get out of it is that we do not need to regulate and we do not need to legislate the need for stronger privacy enhancing technologies, because counterintuitively, it is actually in Facebook's interest and in the interest of companies that collect behavioral information to provide stronger privacy controls, because if they provide stronger privacy controls, people are going to share more information rather than less information. Right? So be it counterintuitive. We also found that privacy, your general privacy preferences were a significant indicator of how risky or not risky you find the information sharing to be, right? So you have, not only is your privacy preference context dependent, but you also have a baseline of how much, how acceptable you find information sharing to be and how unacceptable you find it to be. So to a degree, we also get support for the first hypothesis for the privacy paradox, which is that maybe people simply don't care, right? So again, we have some limitations. Again, we had a convenience sample. It was done with a 200, informatics 200 level class. So it was all people who kind of, were familiar with ICT technologies. It was a small sample, and because it was people, who were studying ICTs, they were relatively more familiar with, risk of information sharing than, say, I don't know, my grandfather would be. Although my grandfather never used Facebook. And of course, this is really gender biased, right? Because this is informatics undergraduate class, so it's almost entirely men, just like this room, right? So, and this is very important. It's very important to recognize when you have a gender biased sample, because if you look at studies of risk acceptance offline, women are usually less risk taking than men are. Do you guys know this? Right? Do you guys know men are 6 times more likely to drown than women are? Do you know why? Because men overestimate how far they can swim. And they drown. Just remember that next time you go swimming. Right? So this is all fun and good, right? We did these studies and we found out that severity is very important. We found out that identity theft is very important. So how do I operationalize it, right? How do I use that information to actually design risk communication that I understand better, right? So this is an example of a typical risk communication for phishing, right? I show people the email. I show them that you get an email which asks you for your social security number, asks you to click on an arbitrary link, and give out information on your bank accounts and all that stuff. It's probably a phishing email. Don't do that, right? Now this is great. Unfortunately, it doesn't take into account a lot of problems, right? Because technology is usually designed for younger adults. It assumes a certain level of technical know-how. It's also designed for younger adults, right? How many people have seen, a Wired article about the most awesome new smartphone that has come out for people over 75? Not that many, right? But at the same time, the world population is aging, right? Right now, 13% of the American population is over 65. And by 2010, well, I guess 2010 has already passed. But 2020, it's supposed to be 25%, right? So, and it's not only just in the United States, but it's in the United States and across the globe. In general, you're getting people, more and more people are getting over 65, and you have less younger adults. At the same time, older adults for whom the technology is not designed are being forced to use these technologies, right? So, for example, I believe before 2011, IRS would send the tax forms, would mail the tax forms to your home. And now they don't mail those tax forms. You have to go and get the tax form from post office. And this is their way of encouraging tax filings online. The other thing that they do to encourage tax filings online, if you file it online, you get your return much quicker, right? So on the one hand, someone over 65 who might have trouble driving and getting to the post office to get the physical form, on the same time, they're being forced to use, like a computer which they might not be as familiar with, right? And they're more likely to fall for things like phishing attacks and spear phishing and that kind of stuff, right? So we need to design not just for young people, but also for older adults, right? People over 65. And this is really difficult because there's a lot of design constraints that go into it, right? Because older adults do not have the same cognitive plasticity as younger adults do, right? So the way to address some of those constraints is to identify what helps the design of a good risk communication. So one thing that the thing that we've tried to do is let's use mental models that are accessible to people over 65, right? So what is the kind of risk that people over 65 have always dealt with, right? So physical risk, right? Theft is something that they understand, right? It needs to be, at the same time, instead of communicating this information in terms of text, you want to communicate this information in terms of video. And when you're using physical mental models, what you want to stress upon is the fact that they have rejected similar risks in the offline world, and it's the same risk that is manifested just using ICT technologies instead of like an offline person. So I'm going to quickly show you a video of what that kind of looks like, and then I'm going to stop here and open up for questions. Hopefully you can hear this.
Good morning. I can do it for you?
I'm Agent Smith with the FBI. I need to ask you a few questions.
Excuse me, I'd like to see that again, please. Yeah, okay. Come on in.
Thank you. I'm here today to ask you a few questions. Could you please state your name?
Richard Cullen. Cullen.
Okay. I need to know where you bank.
You need to know what?
Where you bank.
Where I bank? Monroe County.
And which types of accounts do you have there?
Checking,
Mm-hmm.
savings,
Mm-hmm.
retirement funds.
Retirement?
Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting. I'm going to need to do some further investigation on your accounts, sir.
Wait a minute. What kind of investigation are you talking about?
I can't really discuss it. But I'll need to know your birth date, your social security number, and the account numbers for all these accounts.
You want to know what?
Your birth date, your social security, and the account numbers for all
Yeah.
these accounts.
You want me to write that
My
down for you?
investigation. Go ahead and state them. I'll bring them.
Okay. 123-671-4159.
Okay, and your date of birth?
August 3rd, 1940.
Okay. And let's see, what's the account number on this checking account?
Account number. I don't have that. I'd have to go and get that.
Okay. I'm here today to ask you a few questions on behalf of the auditor's office. Please state your name.
John Cullen. Cullen. Excuse me.
And where do you bank at?
Monroe County.
Okay. The local bank.
Mm-hmm.
And what types of accounts do you have there?
Oh, I got all kinds of accounts. Checking, savings, that sort of thing.
Checking, savings, any investment or retirement accounts?
Yeah, some there, some other places. But I spread it around a little,
I'm going to need to investigate this further.
Wait a minute, what is it you're investigating?
Just some possible discrepancies with some of these accounts.
What kind of discrepancies are we talking about
I
here?
can't really discuss it this early in the investigation. As soon as we can let you know what's going on, we will let you know what's going on.
Well, why don't you just tell me right now, and then I can clear this up for you?
That's the government for you.
Yeah.
That's just the way we work. But I will need your social security number and some of your account numbers.
You want me to give you my account numbers?
Yeah.
And my social security
You're
number?
going to be a pretty integral part of the investigation, I think.
Don't you have that? Don't you have that there? I mean, you're investigating me, you should have my numbers.
Part of our investigation is to see what you tell us.
Oh, okay. Well, what I'm going to tell you is nothing.
Well, we need to know.
Okay, listen, excuse me, man, if you find something to do there, I'm gonna give a call to the bank, if you don't mind, and I'm gonna find out
Certainly.
if they, see any discrepancies or anything like that. I'm
Certainly.
sorry, I do wanna help you here.
Oh, feel free.
You understand
Oh,
that?
of course.
Just a second here.
Oh, my cell phone.
Yeah,
You're right outside.
wait a minute, where are you going? I need to.
Anyways, so that's kind of the idea, right? So, if a guy shows up to your house and asks you to give you, ask you to give him your social security number, I don't think most people in their right minds would do it, right? I mean, someone can show me a badge, but I don't really know what that badge means, right? How many people know what an IRS agent's credentials look like? Anyone? Me neither. How many people know what I don't know, law enforcement, your local law enforcement, what do their credentials look like? Do you guys know? No, right? Impersonation is very easy, and that's the idea. You want to convey to them that you reject the same risk offline, so there's no reason that you should be accepting that risk online. So that's all I have. Do you guys have any questions? My time is up, right? Yeah. I can tell from your faces. Go for it.
Have you ever heard about any
Please use your microphone.
text messages? I've been receiving text messages.
Sorry, I got something.
Yes, just remember, if you're gonna ask a question, go ahead and push your microphone button so that, they can hear.
Okay, I was wondering if you've heard about any phishing by text message, because I've had a couple of times text messages from a random phone number that they know my name, but they're asking me to log on to different things, and there's two different numbers, so I don't know what I did to get this, but have you heard about that, or is there any news on that?
I don't know. I have to say, I've never really personally experienced any phishing text messages, but I've definitely gotten phishing phone calls on Skype, bizarrely enough, and I don't know why. I don't really know that much about text message-based phishing. But that's interesting. I should look into it.
Are you investigating any types of technologies to address phishing? Or will investigate technologies to address phishing?
That address phishing in what way? Like automatically detecting phishing kind of
Yeah,
stuff?
just research in general.
Um,
Because right now I think you're kind of investigating realms of things. Are you going to look at technological things to address these problems?
Right. So the idea is that the insights that we get from this should also inform technical design.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I'm looking at is designing targeted risk communication. So right now, every time you go to an encrypted website, you get a pop-up that says it's not SSL encrypted, right? But it's not dangerous in every context. And it's mostly because, the web browser, it's not a learning agent. So one of the things that we are working with Jim Blythe at ISI is to develop a web browser that kind of detects context and detects whether you're actually at risk or not. So we are working on that, yes. Actually, I think Rachel Greenstad at Drexel is also kind of going to get into that. And I'm sure there are other people who do that too. Do you work with SPAF?
No, I'm just kind of curious. I research for biometrics.
Okay.
And I know biometrics can address a lot of these phishing issues, but not to some extent. So.
Okay. Do you guys have any other questions? You're free to go, by the way.
Okay.
thank you for being patient listeners.